The morning Maggie Garner rode into Dustcreek, Texas, with a busted wagon wheel, $3 to her name, and a loaded pistol she barely knew how to fire. She told herself the worst was already behind her. She was dead wrong. The year was 1878, and the Texas Panhandle wore its summer heat like a punishment. Red dust swirled in lazy columns along the main thoroughfare of Dustcreek, a town that had sprung up around a watering hole and a railway spur with all the grace of a weed pushing through cracked earth. Two saloons faced each other across the wide dirt street like old enemies too tired to fight. A general store, a livery, a telegraph office with a crooked sign, and a sheriff's office with bars on the windows completed the picture. It was not a beautiful place. It was barely a surviving place. But it was the closest town to the plot of land her late father had left her in his will, and so it was, for better or worse, home. Maggie was 24 years old, with dark auburn hair that had come mostly loose from its pins after 2 days of hard riding, and green eyes that had grown harder in the last 6 months than she had ever imagined eyes could grow. Her father, Hector Garner, had died of a fever in the spring, leaving her a parcel of land 40 miles east of Dustcreek, a deed that 3 different men had already tried to take from her by force, and a piece of advice she had not fully understood until now. Trust no one who offers you something for nothing. She had taken that advice so seriously that she had also stopped trusting people who offered her something for something, which had made the last half year a profoundly lonely stretch of road. The wagon wheel had cracked somewhere outside of town, and she had limped the last 2 miles on a rim that screamed against the dry earth like a wounded animal. She pulled the wagon to a stop in front of the livery, climbed down stiffly, and assessed the damage with the same expression she used for most things now, which was a flat, measuring look that said she was calculating cost before she allowed herself to feel anything. The wheel was done. She would need a new one, or at least a new spoke set and a proper iron rim. The livery owner, a heavy-set man named Clyde Pittman who was already watching her from the shade of his stable door, walked over with the slow deliberateness of a man who knew he held the advantage. "That is a bad one," Clyde said. "I can see that," Maggie said. "Going to cost you to fix it." "I assumed." He named a price. It was 3 times what it should have been. She knew that, even with her limited experience, because her father had run a small farm supply operation in Missouri before he caught the land fever that had eventually killed him, and she had helped keep his account since she was 12. She countered. He shook his head. She held firm. He shrugged and walked back to his shade, which she understood was his way of telling her she could find another wheelwright in this desert if she liked. She looked down at the 3 silver dollars in her palm. She looked at the wheel. She looked at the town around her, where every man who passed was giving her the slow, appraising look that a lone woman on a busted wagon attracted in 1878, and not one of those looks contained anything she would have called kindness. She was about to go back to Clyde and tell him she would accept his price when a voice came from behind her, low and unhurried, like a man who had nowhere pressing to be. "He is charging you $4 over the fair rate." Maggie turned. The man leaning against the post of the building next door was tall, with the rangy, deliberate look of someone who had spent most of his life on horseback. He was perhaps 30, maybe a year or 2 older, with dark hair that curled slightly at the collar and a jaw that had not seen a razor in several days. He wore a plain brown coat, trail-worn, and a hat pushed back on his head at an angle that suggested he did not care much about appearances. His boots were dusty. His eyes, which were a deep, steady gray, were watching her with an expression that was neither warm nor cold, simply attentive, the way a good card player watches the table. He was not, at first glance, the kind of man you would describe as handsome. He was the kind of man you looked at twice, because the first glance had not quite resolved into a full picture. "Is that so?" Maggie said. It was not a question. She was not asking for his help. She was simply acknowledging that he had spoken. $2.50 is the going rate for a wheel repair here. I have had it done twice." He nodded at the wagon. "That is a front wheel. Front wheels are simpler than rear on that particular rig, maybe $2 flat if you push him. And why, Maggie said carefully, would you tell me that? The man looked at her for a moment, and something shifted in his expression that she could not quite read, something between wry and weary. Because Clyde Pittman has been overcharging people in this town for 6 years, and nobody calls him on it. I find it tiresome. It was not the answer she had expected. It was also not an answer she entirely trusted, because she had learned that men who offered up useful information to women traveling alone usually had a reason for doing so that was not entirely about Clyde Pittman's pricing habits. She studied him a moment longer, searching for the angle, and then she put the coins back in her pocket and walked back to Clyde. She got the wheel repaired for $2.20. When she turned around afterward, the man was gone. She told herself she did not notice. She also told herself she did not think about him again as she drove the repaired wagon to the boarding house at the end of Dustcreek's Main Street, paid for 3 nights with the coins she had left, carried her single trunk up to a small, hot room on the 2nd floor, and lay on the thin mattress staring at the water-stained ceiling. She thought about him twice before she fell asleep, which was twice more than she intended. His name, she learned the next morning from the boarding house owner, a brisk woman named Mrs. Aldis who had opinions about everything and shared them freely, was Phineas Weston. He was a rancher who had come to the Panhandle 5 years ago from somewhere east, nobody was entirely sure where, and had built himself a working cattle operation about 12 miles north of town. He was known to be fair in his dealings, reasonably quiet, not much for the saloons or the card tables, and he kept to himself in a way that was not unfriendly, simply private. He any trouble? Maggie asked, because she asked that about every man now. Mrs. Aldis gave her a look that contained a great deal of information packed into a very small amount of space. He is the least trouble of anyone in this county, she said, which makes some people nervous. Maggie did not ask what she meant by that. She ate her breakfast salt pork and cold corn bread and coffee that was more ambition than coffee, and thought about the 40 miles between her and her father's land. She had the deed. She had $40 sewn into the hem of her traveling coat, which represented the whole of what remained of her father's estate after debts. She had a pistol she could shoot well enough to hit a fence post at 10 yards, which she considered barely adequate, and a rifle in the wagon she could hit a target at 50 with, which was better. She had no cattle, no lumber for a proper house, no seed for crops, no hired hands, no neighbors who knew her, and no idea how the water situation was on the property beyond what her father's brief letters had mentioned. What she had, and what she had always had, was a quality her father had called stubbornness, and her mother, before she had died when Maggie was 9, had called determination, and which Maggie herself thought of simply as the inability to recognize a situation as impossible until she was already through it. She was going to her land, and she was going to build something there, and she was going to do it without owing anything to anyone. That was the plan. The plan lasted until the afternoon of her 2nd day in Dustcreek, when a man named Dale Cutter walked into Mrs. Aldis's parlor and sat down across from her and told her, in a voice oiled with false courtesy, that her father's deed was disputed. Dale Cutter was about 45, heavyset without being fat, with pale eyes and the particular smile of a man who had spent decades using his smile as a weapon. He was Mrs. Aldis had told her at breakfast in a lowered voice, the largest landowner in the region, which he had become through a combination of genuine enterprise, strategic marriages, and a talent for finding legal complications in other people's property claims at precisely the moment those people were most vulnerable. He sat in Mrs. Aldis's parlor with his hat in his hands, performing courtesy, and told Maggie that her father's deed had an irregularity in the survey line that placed a significant portion of the eastern boundary in dispute with land Cutter himself had registered 2 years prior. "I am sure you understand," Cutter said, that this sort of thing is most easily resolved before anyone invests in improvements. It would be a shame for you to build a house on land that courts might later determine is not yours." Maggie looked at him across the parlor's small table and felt the cold clarity that had been her constant companion since her father's death settle over her like a second skin. "I would need to see the competing survey," she said. "Of course. My attorney has the documents. I would be happy to arrange a meeting." "Where is your attorney?" "San Marcos." That was, she happened to know, almost 200 miles away. She had passed through San Marcos on her way here. "That is convenient," she said. The smile did not waver, but something behind his pale eyes sharpened. He had expected tears or capitulation, or at minimum the flustered uncertainty of a woman alone in a strange territory. He had not expected a flat, direct gaze and a request for documentation. "I also want it understood," Maggie continued, "that until any legal question is resolved, I consider myself the sole rightful owner of the property described in my deed, and I intend to take possession of it." He left shortly after. Mrs. Aldis appeared in the parlor doorway the moment the front door closed behind him, wearing an expression that was partly admiration and partly alarm. "You know what he does to people who push back," Mrs. Aldis said carefully. "I know what he tries to do," Maggie said. "That is not the same thing." She believed it when she said it. She kept believing it until approximately 11 o'clock that night, when she heard something beneath her window, went to look, and found that someone had slashed both of her wagon horse's harness straps to pieces and pried off the front wheel she had just had repaired. She stood in the darkened livery yard for a long moment looking at the damage, her hair loose around her shoulders, her pistol in her hand, and for the first time since her father died she felt not determined or cold or calculated, but simply, genuinely afraid. "That was Cutter's man," said a voice from the darkness near the stable wall. "Fellow named Rowe. He does this sort of thing." She raised the pistol before she had consciously decided to. "Easy," the voice said, and Phineas Weston stepped out of the shadow beside the stable into the thin light of a half-moon, his hands visible, his expression completely unchanged from the day before, that same calm attentiveness, as if finding an armed woman in a livery yard at midnight was a thing that happened to him regularly and he had no strong feelings about it either way. "You were watching my wagon," she said. The pistol was still up. "I was." Cutter did the same thing to the Alderman family last year when they tried to claim their homestead 40 miles east of town. "I recognized the pattern when he came to see you today." She lowered the pistol slowly. Her heart was knocking hard against her ribs, but she kept her voice level. "And you thought to warn me by watching silently instead of actually telling me." He was quiet for a moment. "I thought you would not want to hear it from a stranger." "I would have preferred it to this," she said, gesturing at the ruined harness. Something crossed his face that was close to regret, or at least the shadow of it. "You are right. I should have come to you directly. I was wrong about that." She had expected him to defend himself. The acknowledgement landed strangely, more disarming than an argument would have been. She put the pistol away and looked at the wheel and the slashed leather, and she did the arithmetic, and the arithmetic was not good. New harness leather was expensive. The wheel repair again, time lost, and meanwhile Cutter knew she was here and knew she was alone and knew she did not have the resources for a prolonged fight. "What did the Alderman family do?" she asked. "They sold to him at his price and left. What do you think he would do if I don't?" Phineas was quiet for a moment, looking at the damage with that steady gray gaze. "Escalate," he said simply. "Not violently, not directly. He does not do things directly. But the problems would keep coming until you ran out of money to solve them or out of patience or both." She looked at him. There was a quality to his stillness that she found unusual in men. Most men, in her experience, became uncomfortable with silence and rushed to fill it with noise and motion and assertion. This one simply stood in it, apparently content to let her think. "Why are you telling me all this?" she asked, because she still needed an answer to that question. "Because what he does is wrong," Phineas said, and his voice was quiet and level and entirely without performance. "And because you are clearly going to fight him regardless, and if you are going to fight him, you ought to know what you are fighting." She looked at him for a long time in the moonlight. Something in her chest that had been clenched for a long time did not exactly loosen, but it shifted slightly, the way a knot does when some of the tension goes out of the rope without the knot actually coming undone. She did not trust him. But she did not entirely not trust him either, which was, at this particular point in her life, the closest she came to giving anyone credit. "My harness is destroyed," she said. "I know. I cannot get to my land without harness." "I know that too." She waited. "I have spare harness leather at my ranch," he said. "I also have a spare team if yours need rest. And I know where the county land registry is. And I know a clerk there who will show you every competing claim filed in the past 10 years for your parcel, which I suspect will demonstrate that Cutter's survey claim was filed 6 weeks after your father registered his deed, which would make it legally secondary." She stared at him. "How do you know when my father filed?" "Because I looked at the registry 3 days ago when I heard a woman was coming to claim the Garner land. I knew Cutter would move on it." She should have found that alarming, the idea that a man she had never met had been looking into her affairs. Inexplicably, she did not find it alarming at all. She found it, against every instinct she had spent 6 months sharpening, something very close to reassuring. "You expected him to come after me," she said. "I expected him to try. And you looked up the registry before I even arrived. Why?" He looked at her directly, those gray eyes steady in the moonlight. "Because I also know the land," he said. "Your father's parcel borders mine on the south. I have ridden past that land many times, and it is good land, and whoever works it will be my neighbor, and I prefer my neighbors not to be Dale Cutter." There it was, the explanation she had been searching for, and it was so practical and so unglamorous that she almost smiled. Not charity, not attraction, or at least not primarily. Simply enlightened self-interest in the direction of justice, which was, in her experience, the most reliable form of human goodness there was. "All right, Mr. Weston," she said. "Tell me about the registry." The county land registry was in a town called Harker, 22 miles north, and they rode there 2 days later in Phineas's wagon after he had brought the spare harness leather from his ranch, and repaired hers himself in the gray dawn of the morning after they spoke. She had watched him work and noted that he was efficient without being showy, and that he had brought exactly the right grade of leather, which was a detail that told her he knew horses and he knew harness, and which she found unreasonably comforting in a way she did not examine closely. The ride to Harker took most of a day. The panhandle spread around them in every direction, vast and rust-red and brutal and beautiful in the way that places that can kill you often are. Maggie had grown up in Missouri's gentler green, and she was still learning to read this landscape, to understand how water moved through it and where grass held, and where it gave way to bare caliche. Phineas had been here 5 years, and he pointed things out as they rode: a dry creek bed that ran full in spring, a particular low ridge that broke the worst of the north wind in winter, the way the mesquite grew thicker along a certain line that suggested underground water. He did not lecture. He talked the way someone talks when they love a place and simply cannot help mentioning it, the way you might point out a hawk to someone who is looking the wrong direction, less because you expect them to care and more because you care yourself, and the impulse to share it is stronger than the restraint. She listened carefully, because all of it was information she needed. She also listened because his voice was pleasant. She noticed that too, and she noticed herself noticing, and she set it aside firmly. "The land between here and your parcel," she said. "Whose is that? Some of it is open range. Some of it Cutter grazes on illegally. There is a small homestead about 8 miles out, family named Greer. They have been there 4 years, and they are good people, but they stay very quiet about their opinions where Cutter is concerned. He has scared them. He has made it clear that causing him trouble is expensive. What about you?" she said. "You are clearly not afraid to speak against him." He was quiet for a moment. "I have been careful," he said finally. "I have not given him an opening. My claim is clean, my records are in order, I have not borrowed from any bank he has a hand in, and I do not need anything from him. It is harder to be leaned on when you need nothing from the person leaning. She thought about that. She thought about how deliberately that kind of independence would have had to be constructed over 5 years in a place like this with a man like Cutter watching. It was not careless freedom. It was freedom that had been built the way a fence is built, one post at a time in ground that resisted. That is, she said slowly, a very significant amount of planning. I learned early that this part of Texas rewards it, he said. Where did you come from before here? He glanced at her sideways. It was the first time she had seen anything guarded in his expression, a brief closing of something that had been more open. Tennessee, originally, then a few years in Kansas. I had some dealings with land disputes there that I found instructive. She did not push. The closing of that expression told her there was more to the story and that it was not comfortable, and she of all people knew that some histories were not ready to be told to strangers, regardless of how far along the road to not quite stranger you had already traveled. They reached Harker in the late afternoon, a somewhat larger town than Dustcreek, with a proper courthouse and a land office with regular hours and a clerk named Mr. Tibbs, who was indeed acquainted with Phineas, and who pulled out the relevant records with professional efficiency. The records were clear. Hector Garner had registered his deed in the summer of 1876. Dale Cutter had filed a competing boundary survey in November of the same year, nearly 2 months later. By every principle of territorial land law, Garner's claim had priority. Cutter's survey had been filed as a preemptive nuisance, nothing more, the kind of legal sand thrown in the gears that required money and time to clear, but that had no real legal force. Tibbs made Maggie copies of the relevant documents, and she folded them into the inside pocket of her coat with the calm, deliberate movements of someone securing ammunition. He knows he cannot win this in a proper court, Phineas said as they left the land office. Then why did he file it? Because most people cannot afford a proper court, and they do not know enough to go to the registry themselves and look, and so the threat of a legal dispute is enough to make them leave. But not now. No, not now. She looked at the folded documents in her coat pocket, at the last light going orange across the flat horizon, at this town that had no particular reason to welcome or protect her. She thought about the land 40 miles east that her father had chosen with his last clear-headed act before the land fever killed him. The land that was supposed to be a new start, which had started out looking like a trap. She thought about this man standing next to her outside a land office in the Texas Panhandle in 1878, who had looked up her records before she arrived and corrected Clyde Pittman's prices, and stood in a moonlit livery yard with his hands open and available, and offered her things she had needed without asking for anything in return. The last man she would have expected help from. She had to admit that to herself. A rancher she did not know, in a place she did not know, with no reason she could readily identify to involve himself in her trouble. And yet here they were, with the documents that changed everything sitting in her coat pocket because he had known where to look. She was not in love with him. She was not foolish enough to call what she felt love. But she was aware of him in a way she had not been aware of another person in a very long time, aware of his presence the way you are aware of a fire when you have been cold for months, not rushing toward it, not certain it is safe, but feeling the heat of it regardless. They stayed the night in Harker, at separate boarding houses, and rode back to Dustcreek in the cool of the following morning. Taking possession of her land required, in practical terms, getting 40 miles across open country with a loaded wagon, setting up some form of habitation before the summer heat became lethal, and then beginning the long, grinding work of establishing a working homestead from bare earth. She had her plans, scratched out on paper over many sleepless nights in the weeks before she had left Missouri. A small dugout for the first season, practical and cheap to build, to protect against the winter, a garden plot near whatever water source the land had, and eventually, when she had built enough capital, a proper frame house. What she had not fully planned for was the sheer weight of it, the physical labor of doing all of this alone. Phineas did not offer to help with this. He did not volunteer himself or his ranch hands or any of his resources. He rode back to his ranch after they returned to Dustcreek, and she did not see him for 4 days. She loaded her wagon, paid Mrs. Aldis for her stay, thanked her with genuine warmth, and drove out of Dustcreek toward her land on a hot Tuesday morning with her chest full of something that was part determination and part terror, and part a stubborn, burning love for a place she had not yet seen. The land was better than she had expected. It had a spring, a genuine working spring, tucked into the base of a low limestone shelf at the eastern edge of the property, clear and cold and consistent. The grass on the north side of a gentle rise was not the burned-out stubble she had feared but actual buffalo grass, thick and tough, the kind that had fed cattle herds for generations. There were 4 mature cottonwood trees near the spring, which would provide shade and eventually lumber. The soil in the flat section south of the rise tested dark when she dug a handful and squeezed it, dark and slightly moist, far better than the caliche-heavy land she had passed through further west. She stood in the middle of her land for a long time with her hands at her sides, feeling the heat on her shoulders and the dry wind against her face, and she felt something she had not felt in a very long time, which was the particular quiet that comes when something you have been moving toward finally stops moving and becomes a place. She set up camp near the cottonwoods and began. The first week was hard in every way a first week on raw land is hard, physically punishing, mentally exhausting, and sometimes frightening in the way that being alone with your own capabilities and their limits is frightening. She dug the beginning of the dugout, which was harder work than she had imagined, and by the end of each day her hands were blistered and her back ached deeply. She hunted 2 rabbits with the rifle, which she was proud of, and she cooked them badly, which she was not proud of, and she ate them anyway. On the 8th day, she heard hoofbeats and put her hand on the rifle before she could stop herself, and then Phineas Weston rode into the shade of her cottonwoods on a big red roan, with a pack-horse behind him carrying lumber. She stared at him. "You are building a dugout," he said, looking at the half-excavated hole she had been working on. "I am. You need shoring lumber for the walls or it will collapse in the first heavy rain." She looked at the pack-horse. She looked at him. She felt the complex pulling tension of wanting to accept help and not wanting to be in debt, which was a tension she was thoroughly tired of. "What do you want for it?" she asked. "Nothing," he said. "That is not how things work." He got down from his horse. He was quieter on the ground than most men, moving without the particular intentional weight that men often put into their movements when they wanted to be noticed. "When I built my first house out here, I had 2 neighbors ride over with materials I had not asked for and help I had not asked for. Both of them refused payment. I promised myself I would pass that on when I could." She thought about this for a moment. "That is a very convenient story," she said, "but without much heat." "It is also true." She looked at the lumber and at her half-finished hole in the ground and at the blisters on her hands, and she thought about her father and about the ways pride can be a tool and the ways it can be a trap, and she said, "Thank you. That is genuinely kind." He unloaded the lumber without ceremony, stacked it with the particular neatness of someone who had unloaded lumber many times, and then looked at her excavation with a professional eye. "You are about 2 feet short on the south wall. The spring floods in a wet year, not much, but enough to come up under a short wall. I know because I have surveyed this land and I know where the flood line is." "You surveyed my land," she said. "I surveyed the area between my land and yours years ago because I was considering purchasing it. I decided against it because I did not need more land and I did not have enough water for it. Your spring would change that calculus, but it is not my spring." "No," she said, "it is not." There was a moment between them that was not comfortable, but was also not uncomfortable. A kind of honest reckoning between 2 people who understood each other's positions clearly. "I will take your advice about the south wall," she said. "And I will not take your labor, because That is a debt I cannot pay, and I find those things worse than being short-handed." He nodded once, without argument, and she was grateful for the absence of the wounded male pride that would have accompanied that same conversation with most men she had known. He stayed for a few hours, sitting near the horses while she worked, answering questions when she asked them, which she did with increasing frequency, because his knowledge of this particular land and climate was genuinely invaluable. He told her about the hawk populations that took young chickens if you did not build the coop properly. He told her that the buffalo grass would survive a hard winter without much help, but that a garden needed a windbreak on the north side or the November winds would destroy everything. He told her about a man in Dustcreek, a Mexican craftsman named Vargas, who built stoves that heated efficiently in the cold and were superior to anything shipped in from back east. When the sun dropped toward the horizon, he made ready to leave, and she walked with him to his horse, which felt natural in a way she was not ready to examine. "You will come back," she said. It came out less like a question and more like something she was testing the truth of. He looked at her with those gray eyes in the orange light, and there was something in his expression that was careful and genuine all at once. "If you want me to," he said. She thought about a great many things in the space of that pause, about what trust was and how you arrived at it, about the ways she had been hurt and the ways she had been hardened, and the ways hardening was not the same as being strong. She thought about how he had appeared and reappeared at the moments when she needed information or materials, never pushing, never demanding, never performing the helpfulness that she would have recognized as manipulation. She thought about the registry documents in her coat and about the harness leather and about the honest, unadorned way he talked about the land he knew and loved. "Yes," she said, "I want you to." He rode away into the copper evening, and she stood in the cooling air and watched him until the dust he raised was the same color as the sky and she could no longer tell where one ended and the other began. She thought, "I do not trust him yet, but I am going to." And she understood that this was, for her, a more significant statement than love. He came back 3 days later, and then 3 days after that, and then the visits began to lengthen, and the intervals between them began to shorten, until it was simply a fact of her days that Phineas Weston would appear at some point in the afternoon, and they would work through the last hours of daylight in a companionable nearness that had, without either of them precisely deciding it, become one of the anchors of her week. He never imposed himself on the work. He brought things occasionally, small useful things, a packet of herb seeds, a proper hinged door for the dugout that he said was from a building he had torn down, a length of chain for the well bucket she was digging. He always had explanations for these things that were practical and not sentimental, and she had come to understand that this was his language, that he expressed care in practical gestures the way some people expressed it in words, and that the gestures were no less genuine for being wordless. She told him about her father one evening, sitting on the limestone shelf above the spring where the air was cooler, and the view spread west toward a sky burning red and purple. She had not planned to talk about her father. She rarely did. But Phineas had asked, not pryingly, simply with the genuine interest of a person who wanted to understand another person, and she had found herself talking. She told him about the farm in Missouri, and about her father's letters in the last years that had grown increasingly full of this land, this particular land, as if he had found something he had been looking for his whole life, and was trying to pass the discovery on to her through words alone. She told him about the last months, the fever, the way his mind had cleared in the final weeks in that terrible sharp way that sometimes happened at the end, and how he had made her promise to come here, not with desperation but with a calm certainty that she could do this, that she was the person for this. "He was right," Phineas said quietly. She glanced at him. "He was also leaving me a great deal of trouble. He trusted you to handle it. He did not know about Cutter. He knew there would be something. He still sent you." She was quiet for a moment, turning this over. She had been in her private grief, somewhat angry with her father for the trouble the land had turned out to carry, and this reframe struck something in her that was both challenging and releasing. "You sound very certain about the character of a man you never met," she said, but not unkindly. "I am certain about what you are," he said, and then seemed to hear himself say it, and the particular quality of stillness he usually wore shifted briefly into something more exposed, color rising slightly at the edge of his jaw in the fading light. She looked at him and felt the warmth that had been building in her chest for weeks resolve itself a little more clearly into something she could name but was not yet ready to say. "What happened in Kansas?" she asked, because she had been wondering for weeks, and because she understood now that he would tell her if she asked directly. He was quiet for a long time, long enough that she thought he might not answer. Then he said, "I had a partner, a man I trusted completely, who it turned out had been slowly registering our shared land in his name alone for 2 years while I believed we were building something together. By the time I discovered it, there was nothing I could do legally because the paperwork was in order and I had been too trusting and too careless with the details." She was very still, listening. "I lost everything I had built in 4 years," he said. "The stock, the improvements, the land itself. I came here because I needed to start somewhere that nobody knew my name or my history, and because I had decided I would do things differently this time. Carefully. Alone." "And then you spent the last several weeks helping a stranger," she said. He looked at her, and there was something in the gray of his eyes in the last light that was deeper than anything she had seen there before, something that had been carefully contained and was now, in this particular moment, allowing itself to be visible. "You did not feel like a stranger for very long," he said. The silence after that was a different kind of silence than they had sat in before, charged and aware and full of things that neither of them said but that both of them understood were there. She was not afraid of it. That was the thing she noticed most. She had expected to be afraid, because fear had been her companion for so long that she had begun to think it was permanent. But sitting on this limestone shelf above her spring on her land in the fading August heat next to this careful, honest, quietly remarkable man, she was not afraid at all. She took his hand. She did it simply, without drama, just reached out and covered his long, work-roughened hand with hers and held it. He turned his hand under hers and held hers back. They sat like that until the stars came out, not saying anything more, because nothing more needed to be said just then, and the night air above the panhandle was enormous and full of silence, and the distant sound of coyotes, and the particular electricity of two people who have finally found the right language for each other. Dale Cutter did not give up easily. She had known he would not, and she was not surprised when she rode into Dustcreek 2 weeks later for supplies, and found a notice posted on the general store door informing her, in the formal language of legal threat, that the boundary dispute had been referred to a circuit court in San Marcos, and that she was required to appear in person to defend her claim or risk judgment in default. She stood in front of that notice for a full minute, reading it twice, and then she pulled it off the door with a calm that surprised even her. She had the registry documents. She had the dates. She had Mr. Tibbs's signed certification of the filing order. A circuit court, if it was a real circuit court and not one in Cutter's pocket, would look at those documents and dismiss the claim in less time than it took to hear it. The question was whether the circuit court was real or whether it was Cutter's. She found Phineas at the blacksmith's, waiting on a repaired wagon axle, and showed him the notice. He read it carefully twice, with the particular focused attention he gave to everything important. "I know the circuit judge," he said. "Of course you do." The corner of his mouth moved in a way that was not quite a smile, but contained all the elements of one. Judge Morales. He came through Dustcreek 2 years ago on a boundary dispute between a rancher and the railroad. He was fair, more than fair. He found against the railroad, which took some courage. "You think he would be fair with Cutter? I think he would be fair with the documents you have," Phineas said. "Which is all that matters." She thought of something then, looking at his face, at the straightforward confidence in his expression, the absence of anything that looked like doubt or evasion. She thought, this is what trust actually feels like. Not the feeling of certainty that someone will never do anything wrong, but the feeling of certainty that if they say something is true, they have verified it before they said it. That if they give you information, they have tested it first. That they are on your side not out of obligation or attraction, but because they have looked at the situation and they have decided with full information and full clarity that your side is the right side. She had trusted people before. She had trusted them too quickly, with the open, warm trust of someone who had not yet learned that trust given without evidence was not trust at all but simply hope wearing trust's clothing. She had been hurt by that kind of trusting more than once, and had responded by closing herself like a fist. This was different. This was trust that she had built piece by piece, evidence by evidence, watching this man make good on everything he said, watching him offer things without demand and tell hard truths without cruelty, watching him handle the space between them with a patience and a respect that she had not known men were capable of until now. He was not the last man she would have expected help from because he was untrustworthy. He was the last man she would have expected help from because she had stopped expecting help from anyone, and here he was, helping and being exactly who he appeared to be, which in her experience was the rarest thing in the world. "Phineas," she said. He looked at her. "I trust you," she said, plainly, simply, the way he said things. "I want you to know that." Something happened in his expression that she had never seen happen in anyone's face before, not the gratified look of someone receiving a compliment, not the warm flush of someone getting something they wanted, but something quieter and more fundamental, the look of someone for whom a thing they had stopped believing they could have has just become real. His throat moved. "That means more to me than you know," he said. "I think I know," she said, "because it means the same to me." They rode to San Marcos 3 weeks later together, in Phineas's sturdier wagon, with her documents and his registered survey of the border between their properties, which established clearly that his line and her line met exactly where Hector Garner's deed said they did, and nowhere that intersected with anything Cutter claimed. The circuit court hearing lasted less than 2 hours. Judge Morales was a small, precise man with silver-streaked hair and the manner of someone who had heard every form of legal nonsense imaginable and was not impressed by any of them. He examined the documents with the thoroughness of a man who understood that the details were the point. He asked Cutter's attorney several pointed questions that the attorney answered with increasing discomfort. He looked over his spectacles at Maggie once, a long, measuring look that reminded her of the way her father used to look at her when he was deciding whether she was serious. She looked back at him with the flat, steady green gaze that she had arrived in Dustcreek with. He dismissed Cutter's claim in full, awarded her legal costs from Cutter's filing, and noted for the record that filing a boundary dispute against a documented prior claim was a waste of the court's time and resources that he hoped would not be repeated. She and Phineas ate supper at a hotel restaurant in San Marcos that night, across a table with a white cloth and candles, which felt impossibly formal after weeks of campfire meals at her homestead, and they drank a glass of wine each, and she laughed for the first time in many months, a real laugh, full-chested and uncalculated, at something he said about the expression on Cutter's attorney's face when Judge Morales read out the decision. She had not known, until she heard it come out of herself, how much she had missed laughing, how much she had missed feeling light. Phineas was watching her laugh with an expression that was entirely unguarded, and when she caught him at it, he did not look away, just held her gaze with that steady honesty that was becoming as familiar to her as the sound of the spring on her land. "You are very beautiful," he said, "when you are not carrying all of that." She considered him across the white cloth and the candles, this man she had not expected, this entirely different kind of man from any kind she had known. "I am working on putting it down," she said. "It is taking a while." "Take whatever time you need," he said. "I will be here." It was not a declaration, or it was not only a declaration. It was also, knowing him, a statement of intent, the kind of thing he said when he had already determined it was true and was simply reporting the fact. She believed him completely. She reached across the white cloth and put her hand on his, and he turned his hand under hers the same way he had done on the limestone shelf in the August dark, and the restaurant noise continued around them, and the candles burned, and none of it touched the quiet at the center of the table where two people had found something they had each, separately and painfully, decided they were never going to find. The autumn came to the Panhandle the way everything came to it, with a bluntness and a velocity that demanded respect. The north winds arrived in October with a conviction that told you very clearly that you needed to be ready before they did. Maggie had her dugout finished and properly shored, her winter garden put up, 24 jars of canned vegetables in a root cellar she had dug behind the dugout, a cook stove from Varga's in Dustcreek that was as good as Phineas had promised, and a small flock of 6 chickens in a predator-proof coop that had survived 3 attempts by the local hawk population. She was not comfortable, not by the standards of Missouri or anywhere east. But she was warm and she was fed and she was home, and that was a thing she thought about every single morning when she woke up, that this hard, beautiful, improbable piece of Texas was home. Phineas came to see her twice a week through October, and by November the twice-a-week visits had acquired a quality of necessity that neither of them pretended was purely practical. He brought things for the winter, extra stove wood, a heavy wool blanket from the trading post in Dustcreek that he said was from a Comanche trade and was the warmest thing available in the territory, a side of salted pork from his autumn slaughter. She stopped arguing about the gifts, partly because she was past the point where she needed to prove her independence to him, and partly because she had started doing things for him in return with the same quiet practicality, mending his coat where a seam had split, keeping a standing invitation to supper on the 2 evenings a week he rode over, making the strong tea he preferred because he had mentioned once, without complaint, that he had run out of it. Care exchanged in practical gestures. That was the language they shared, and she loved it, the specific, particular, unhurried love of someone who has finally found the right language after years of being unable to make herself understood. On a cold evening in November, with the stove making the dugout warm against the howl of the north wind outside, she told him that she loved him. She had thought about how to say it, and in the end she said it the way he said things, plainly, while she was pouring his tea, setting the cup in front of him at the small table she had built herself from the cottonwood wood, looking at him with the direct green gaze that was as much her as anything. "I love you, Phineas," she said. "I want you to know that. Not because I owe you anything or because I need anything more from you than I already have, but because it is true, and I believe you are a man who deserves to hear true things." He looked up at her, and for a moment she saw all of it, all the Kansas loss and the years of careful solitude, and the slow, deliberate building of something in himself that could sustain another hard winter, and then another after that. And beneath all of it, beneath the caution and the patience and the controlled competence, something enormous and alive that had been waiting for exactly this. He stood up from the table, which brought him close to her in the small, warm space of the dugout, and he put his hands on her face very gently, as if she were something he had to be careful with. And she understood that he was not being careful because he thought she was fragile, but because he knew the weight of what was happening, and he did not want to be careless with it. "I have been in love with you," he said, "since you looked at Clyde Pittman's price and did not flinch, and then turned around and asked me why I was telling you something useful." There was a note of something almost wondering in his voice, as if he were still slightly surprised by his own heart. "I thought there is a person who has looked at the world honestly and survived it and is still capable of standing straight." She laughed, a small, warm sound. "That is a very odd thing to fall in love with someone over." "It is the only thing worth falling in love with someone over," he said, and then he kissed her, And it was the kind of kiss that happens between two people who have both been patient for a long time and who both understand what they are giving and receiving, careful at first and then not careful at all, just true. They were married in the spring. It was a small wedding by most standards, held outdoors on the limestone shelf above the spring where they had first sat together and talked honestly about their histories, because both of them felt that was the right place for it. Mrs. Aldous came from Dustcreek and cried happily, which she denied. The Greer family came from their homestead 8 miles away, and Maggie was moved to see them there because she understood what it had cost them, in the face of what Cutter represented in this county, to come out openly and celebrate something he would have wished unsuccessful. The blacksmith and his wife came. Mr. Tibbs from the Harker registry came, which she had not expected and which delighted her. Vargas the stove-maker came and brought flowers that his wife had grown. The minister from Dustcreek performed the ceremony in the clean April air, with the cottonwoods putting out their first pale leaves above them, and the spring running clear below. And Maggie Garner became Maggie Weston with a directness and a certainty that felt nothing like an ending and entirely like a beginning. She kept her father's name alongside it, because the land had been his first, and she thought that was right. Phineas's vows were not the conventional ones. He had written them himself, which she had not known he was going to do, and when he spoke them she had to work not to cry, because he said, among other things, that she had given him back something he had thought was permanently gone, which was the belief that what you build together with the right person cannot be taken from you, because it lives in both of you equally and cannot be registered in anyone else's name. He said it in the plain, unhurried way he said everything important, looking at her directly with those steady gray eyes, and she heard every word of it go into the place where it needed to go. Dale Cutter, for his part, made one more attempt. In the summer after the wedding, he sent a man to Maggie with an offer to purchase the land at a price that was, she had to admit, fair by market standards. She sent the man back with a note that said she was not selling and did not anticipate selling in her lifetime or her children's lifetimes. She heard that Cutter had been furious at the phrasing. She was not sorry. They moved out of the dugout and into the frame house that Phineas and 3 hired hands built over the summer, a proper house with 2 rooms and a covered porch facing east toward where the spring caught the morning light, and a kitchen with Vargas's best cookstove, and a bedroom with a real window. She planted her garden with a windbreak, and the garden flourished. She planted winter wheat in the north field, and it came up thick in the autumn. She built her chicken flock to 20 hens and a rooster, and began selling eggs in Dustcreek on her supply runs. Phineas brought 50 head of cattle to graze on the buffalo grass side of her land, which was a formal arrangement between them that she had insisted on putting on paper, not because she did not trust him, but because she believed in the clarity of formal agreements between people who intended to stay together for a long time. He had agreed with the kind of quiet approval that told her he respected her for it. The work was hard. Life in the Panhandle in the late 1870s was hard in ways that could not be softened or talked around. The winters were brutal. The summers were merciless. The distances between people and services and help were vast in ways that made every small failure expensive and every large one potentially catastrophic. She was not naive about any of this. She did not love the hard parts. But she lived the full reality of the place she had chosen, and she had chosen it honestly, and she did not regret a moment of it. What she loved, specifically and precisely, and with a depth that surprised her even now, was this: coming in from the field in the evening to a lit window. Supper together at the kitchen table she had built, their voices mixing in the warm air. The sound of him moving in the house in the early morning before she was fully awake, already starting the stove, the particular domestic evidence of being not alone. His hands, work-scarred and capable, reaching across the table for hers. His laugh, which was infrequent and therefore precious, low and genuine, always at something actually funny rather than at anything merely polite. She trusted him. That was the foundation of everything. She trusted him not because she had decided to, not as an act of will or hope, but because he had earned it, piece by piece and month by month, in 100 small demonstrations of his character that had accumulated into something as solid and reliable as the limestone shelf above her spring. In the winter of 1879, she discovered she was expecting a child. She told him in the kitchen on a January morning with ice on the window and the stove burning warm, handing him his coffee and then sitting down across from him and saying it plainly, because that was how they told each other important things. He was very still for a moment, holding his coffee, and then he set it down and looked at her with an expression she had never seen on his face before, not the calm attentiveness, not the guarded care, not even the warmth she had come to know so well, but something undone and luminous and enormous. "Are you all right?" he asked, and his voice was different, quieter. "I am very well," she said. He came around the table and she stood and he held her, just held her, his arms around her in the kitchen warmth with the January wind against the window, and she felt his face in her hair and felt him breathe, and understood that this man who held himself with such careful, deliberate composure was, in this moment, not composed at all, and that she was the only person in the world who would ever see this particular version of him, and she held that knowledge with everything she had. Their son was born in August of 1880, in the bedroom of the frame house with the east-facing window, attended by Mrs. Aldous, who had declared herself expert enough in midwifery to manage it, and had been, in fact, entirely competent. Phineas had been in the barn for most of it, performing unnecessary tasks with the concentrated focus of a man who had nowhere to go but could not stay still, and she had heard from Mrs. Aldous afterward that he had shoed all 4 horses and stacked every piece of lumber on the property before it was over. She had understood this perfectly. Activity was his way of being present in the things he could not control, the same way her way was planning. They were different expressions of the same underlying love of preparation over panic. They named the boy Henry Garner Weston for her father. It had been Phineas's suggestion, offered quietly one evening several months before the birth, and she had felt the particular quality of love that comes when someone does something kind that you had not asked for, and that costs them nothing but the thought of it, which was, perhaps, the most revealing kind of kindness there was. Henry was a robust and opinionated baby who announced his needs at considerable volume, and who, from the earliest age, displayed an interest in horses that was practically professional in its intensity. By the time he was 2, he was being set on the back of Phineas's roan, while Phineas led it at a walk around the paddock, and the baby's expression in these moments was one of absolute beatific seriousness. "He has your face when you are thinking about something important," Phineas told her one evening, watching the boy toddle determinedly across the kitchen floor toward a stray chicken that had gotten in through the door. "He has your patience," she said. "He has been working on catching that chicken for 20 minutes and he has not given up or changed tactics." "That is not patience," Phineas said with the ghost of a smile. "That is stubbornness. Your word or mine?" "Yours," he said. "I would call it determination." She laughed, and the sound of it filled the kitchen, and the chicken escaped and Henry stood in the middle of the floor looking profoundly philosophical about the outcome, and the stove was warm, and the east-facing window was going orange with the evening, and Maggie Weston, who had been Maggie Garner, who had arrived in Dustcreek, Texas, one hot summer morning with $3 and a broken wheel and a heart like a clenched fist, stood in her kitchen and felt the full, unqualified weight of a life that was, by every measure that mattered, exactly right. She thought about trust that morning the way she sometimes did, turning it over like a smooth stone she had found and kept because of the particular quality of its weight in the hand. She thought about the girl who had driven into Dustcreek looking at every outstretched hand for the angle. She thought about what it had cost to learn to open her own hand and let someone take it. She thought about Phineas standing in the moonlit livery yard with his hands open and available, and she thought, I almost missed this. I was so practiced at missing it that I nearly succeeded. She was grateful for the stubbornness, or the determination, that had let her keep looking even when looking felt foolish. She was grateful for a man who had understood that she needed to find her own way to trust and had not tried to hurry her toward it. She was grateful for her father's land and his faith in her, and for the spring that ran cold from the limestone shelf, and for the cottonwood trees, and for the buffalo grass, and for every small specific thing that had accumulated into this life. 2 years later, in 1882, she had a daughter. They named her Clara, and she arrived in October with the north wind howling around the house as if personally invested in her entrance. And she was small and fierce and dark-haired like her father. And from the very beginning, she had a quality of watching the world with a kind of comprehensive assessment that reminded Maggie powerfully and consistently of a certain pair of gray eyes measuring a situation before deciding what it required. Henry, at 2 years old, was profoundly unimpressed by his sister for approximately 3 days, and then one morning Maggie found him standing at the cradle in the bedroom, with his small face arranged in an expression of gravity and importance, talking to the baby in a low, earnest murmur that she could not quite make out. And she stood in the doorway and watched it and felt something in her chest that was too large for any single word to hold. She was standing there watching her son talk to her daughter in the morning light when Phineas came up behind her and put his hand on the back of her neck in the quiet, habitual way he had, and looked over her head at the scene in the bedroom, and she felt him exhale. "We built this," she said quietly. "We built this," he agreed. His voice had that quality it sometimes had when something was large enough to make him careful with the words, measured and full. She turned to look at him, right there in the doorway with the baby noise from the bedroom and the stove going in the kitchen and the panhandle spreading out in every direction beyond the walls they had put up together. And she saw him clearly, as she always did, the careful man who had become her partner, the honest man who had become her home, the last man she would ever have expected to be both of those things, who had become the first and only man she had ever truly trusted. "I love you," she said. He smiled, which he did more now than he had in the beginning, a full, unhurried smile that changed his whole face into something warm and open that she suspected very few people in the world had ever seen. "I know," he said. "I love you too." Henry, from the bedroom, announced to his sister in a tone of considerable authority that she was going to have to learn to ride, and that he would teach her when she was bigger, and that this was going to be good. Maggie laughed again, that same full laugh that had surprised her in the restaurant in San Marcos on the night they had won, and Phineas leaned down and kissed her temple, and the autumn wind moved through the cottonwoods outside, and the spring ran cold below the limestone shelf, and the buffalo grass held against the panhandle sky, and everything that needed to be was. The years that followed were not without difficulty. No years on that land were without difficulty. There were bad winters and dry summers, and a cattle illness in 1883 that took several of Phineas's herd before they understood what it was. And there was the ongoing, grinding business of being a woman with legal standing in a county where that was not universally accepted. Because whatever Judge Morales had decided, and whatever court had validated her deed, there were men who looked at her land and still saw an opportunity because she was a woman, and women, in their calculation, did not hold each time she held. Each time she had what she needed, the documents, the knowledge, the stubborn clarity, and increasingly the reputation that a woman who had beaten Dale Cutter in circuit court was not a woman you tried your luck with lightly. Cutter himself declined steadily in the mid-1880s, as several of his land acquisitions came under federal scrutiny, and several of the people he had driven off began returning with lawyers and federal land agents. And by 1885, he had sold most of his holdings and left the county for reasons nobody discussed too precisely, but that everyone understood had to do with the growing reach of proper law and order into a region that had previously had very little of either. His departure was greeted with satisfaction in Dustcreek, and a significant quiet party at the Greer homestead to which Maggie and Phineas were invited and attended with genuine pleasure. The Greers, emboldened by the changed landscape, had expanded their operation and prospered, and their eldest daughter had married the Vargas boy from Dustcreek, and the table at their party was full and loud and generous. On the ride home that night, with Henry asleep against Maggie's side in the wagon and Clara already gone under in Phineas's lap, Maggie looked up at the immense Texas sky with its winter stars, brilliant and cold and impossibly numerous, and thought about everything that had gathered itself into this moment, all the roads that had led here, all the things that had had to go right and wrong in precisely the ways they had. "Do you remember what you said," she asked Phineas, "when I asked you why you told me about Clyde Pittman's prices?" He was quiet for a moment, and she knew he was remembering. "I said I found it tiresome," he said. "That was the least romantic thing anyone has ever said to me," she said, "and I have thought about it more times than anything else." She felt more than heard him laugh, the subtle shift in the air beside her, the warmth of it. "I did not know you were going to marry me," he said. "No," she agreed. "You were just being honest about the situation. That is what you do. Is that enough?" He said, and there was something in the question that was genuine, that small vulnerability she had learned to recognize in him, the honest question underneath the composed surface. She put her head against his shoulder, which woke neither sleeping child, and looked up at the stars through the dark winter air. "It is more than enough," she said. "It is everything." The farm grew, as good farms do when they are loved and worked and tended by people who understand both the land and each other. By the late 1880s, there were 100 acres under cultivation or managed grazing, a proper barn, a second room added to the house, a covered well with a pump, and a small apple orchard that had taken 3 years to take hold in the caliche soil, but that by 1888 was producing enough fruit that Maggie was selling dried apples in Dustcreek, and to a trader who came through twice a year from Amarillo. Henry at 8 was, as predicted, horse-mad, incompetent, and serious in the way that children are serious when they have learned something real, riding alongside his father on the short cattle drives, and absorbing everything about the land with the same bottomless attention that Phineas had brought to it when he was young. Clara at 6 was a reader, voracious and opinionated, and Maggie had written twice to schools in Amarillo about the possibility of proper schooling, because she intended that her daughter would have every education available and would know she was entitled to it. There was a schoolteacher who had come to Dustcreek in 1886, a young woman named Miss Pryor who was educated and determined, and who had set up a proper school in the back room of the general store with 4 desks and a slate board, and both children attended twice a week when weather and work permitted, and Maggie had become close friends with Miss Pryor, which was a friendship she valued greatly. The kind of friendship between 2 women who understood what it meant to be doing something real in a landscape that had not been designed with women in mind. The injustices of that landscape were real, and she did not pretend otherwise. She had seen what happened to the Comanche families still in the territory, pushed and pressed by policy and by men like Cutter, and by the sheer weight of American expansion into lands that had been theirs for generations, and she felt the weight of that in a way she could not fully articulate. Phineas felt it too. They spoke of it sometimes in the evenings, carefully and without easy answers, because there were no easy answers, only the effort to be honest about what you were seeing and to treat the human beings in front of you as human beings deserve to be treated, which was not enough but was what they had. On a clear evening in the summer of 1889, 11 years after Maggie had driven a busted wagon into Dustcreek with $3 in her pocket and a heart like a clenched fist, she sat on the limestone shelf above the spring with her daughter sleeping against her side and her husband beside her, and the vast, indifferent, astonishing Texas sky doing what it always did, which was everything all at once, without apology. Henry was down at the barn. She could hear him talking to the horses in the low, authoritative murmur he had developed, the one that made the horses calm and attentive, the same murmur she had heard him use with his sister when she was a baby. He was 9 now and already himself, already the person he was going to be, stubborn and patient and honest, with his father's gray eyes and her auburn hair and something in him that was entirely his own. Clara shifted in her sleep against Maggie's side and made a sound of small, complete contentment. Phineas put his arm around Maggie, and she leaned into him, and she thought about trust in the way she sometimes did out here at the end of a day, with the spring running below them and the land spreading out around them in every direction, and the stars beginning to appear in the deep blue east. She thought about what it had cost to build this. Not in money or labor, though both had been considerable, in the willingness to remain open in a world that gave you good reasons to close, in the ability to look at a man in a moonlit livery yard and allow his open hands to be evidence of something rather than a trick. She had not done it alone. She had done it with him. With this man who had met her in her most defended, most closed-off moment and had not tried to get past the defenses but had simply shown her, consistently and patiently and with complete honesty, that there was a world on the other side of them worth coming out for. She had trusted him, and she had been right to trust him. And from that first trust everything else had followed, the land and the house and the children and the years and the 1,000 daily evidences of a life built well, the accumulated weight of two people who had decided, separately and painfully and then together, that the world was worth the risk of being in it. "What are you thinking about?" Phineas asked. His voice was quiet in the evening air. "Everything," she said, "all of it, beginning to now." He was quiet for a moment. She felt him look out at the land they had made together. "Any regrets?" he asked, and there was something light in it because he knew the answer but he liked to hear it. "Not one," she said. "Not a single one." Clara murmured in her sleep and turned closer, and the horses made their sounds in the barn below, and the cottonwoods moved in the evening wind that came from the west most summers, steady and warm and carrying the smell of dry grass and open space, the smell of the panhandle, the smell that had become so entirely the smell of home that she could no longer imagine a home that did not contain it. She thought, "I came here with $3 and a broken wheel and a father's faith and a heart that had forgotten how to open." She thought, "I found everything." She thought, "It was always here, I just had to get to it." Above the spring, below the enormous sky, in the last warm light of a Texas evening in 1889, Maggie Weston held her daughter and leaned against her husband and listened to her son talk to the horses. And she was, in every way that a person can be, home.